Thank you very much, Kanta, for enlightening us and focusing on this difficult subject. The last speaker on this panel is Major Dr. Bryan Price. Major Dr. Bryan Price is the director of the Combating Terrorism Center and an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Major Dr. Bryan Price is a former aviator and current FA-59 strategist who has served in a variety of command and staff positions in operational assignments to include deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. He holds a BSc degree in history, a BA in history from the United States Military Academy, an MA in international relations from St. Mary's University, and a Master of Arts and a PhD in political science from Stanford. In addition to published work on the effects of leadership decapitation against terrorist organizations, his research interests include the organizational behavior of terrorist groups, counterterrorism policy, national security, and United States foreign policy. He has taught courses on international relations, foreign policy, and U.S. national security. Without any further ado, the podium is yours.
Good morning. I want to first thank IDC and ICT, as well as Dr. Ganor and my dear friend, Dr. Asaf Mogadam, for inviting me to this great conference and for allowing me to present along with all these great speakers. For my portion, it's my goal to be brief, especially as the last speaker, but hopefully a bit provocative as well. Now, the title of my talk is The Challenges of Counterterrorism, Trying to Cure an Incurable Disease. And when I first crafted my talk on the similarities between cancer and terrorism, I didn't know that I would be on a panel seated next to an esteemed medical doctor. I asked Dr. Ahmed if she wanted to give my talk for me, but she politely declined. So today, what I hope to do is to propose an alternative framework for how we view counterterrorism. Now, to begin with, it's important to understand the predominant approaches that policymakers and academics use for counterterrorism. And among three of the most prominent are the war model, which views terrorism as primarily a military problem, the legal criminal justice model, which views terrorism like a crime and champions the work of law enforcement and the judicial system, like you heard from several of my colleagues. And finally, the reconciliation model, which views terrorism like a political problem and looks to negotiations and political reforms to address the root causes. Of course, it is rare to find a country that employs only a single approach. After all, they are not mutually exclusive, but generally speaking, it's not difficult to identify a state's predominant approach. Now, about 8 years ago, two researchers, Stairs and Yakubian, offered an outside-the-box framework to better understand terrorism. Instead of conceptualizing terrorism as a predominantly military or law enforcement problem, they argued that the best way to understand Islamic militancy was as a contagious disease. And they use terms familiar with that are in epidemiology parlance, namely agents, vectors, and hosts, to explain the process. The agent, what they believed was an anti-Western and Islamist militant ideology, infected their hosts, the vulnerable populations of the Middle East and the Arab world writ large, via a process of social contagion, namely through vectors, which they believed were radical mosques, madrasas, and the internet. Now, the metaphor that terrorism was like an infectious disease was not new. Richard Haass, then director of policy planning at the U.S. State Department, and now the current president of the Council on Foreign Relations, made this exact analogy in a speech a few years back. The challenge of terrorism, he said, was, quote, akin to fighting a virus. We can take steps to prevent it, protect ourselves from it, and when an attack occurs, quarantine it, minimize the damage it inflicts, and attack it with all our power. So while the notion that terrorism could be like an infectious disease was not necessarily new, the counter-epidemic approach to counterterrorism was. It was novel, it was intuitive, and straightforward, and it was attractive for a number of reasons. After all, the infectious diseases have explicit cause and effect relationships. More importantly, infectious diseases can be cured. To destroy the agent, the anti-Western jihadist ideology, you just had to stop the vectors that transmit the disease, which in their model was the radical mosques and madrasas, and try to inoculate the vulnerable masses from, quote, exposure to this violent ideology. While I believe we can learn a lot from an epidemiological approach to counterterrorism, I think there are several problems with viewing terrorism like an infectious disease. First, we know that Islamic militancy doesn't necessarily behave like an infectious disease. For example, millions of Muslims have been exposed to extremist ideology, but very, very few ultimately take the leap and engage in terrorism. Although there is certainly a social component to the transmission of jihadist ideology, the overwhelming majority of those exposed to the disease don't necessarily become terrorists. Second, this approach gives the false hope that we can actually cure Islamic militancy. Notwithstanding the United States' ill-worded war on terrorism, terrorism is what it is. It's a tactic. It's a form of political violence that has been around for a long, long time. In the fog of recovering from the September 11th attacks, the U.S. said in its national counterterrorism strategy in 2003 that it wanted to, quote, defeat terrorism, which was an unattainable goal and a ridiculous concept to boot. As it has been said before, it's tantamount to saying that we are going to defeat amphibious landings or strategic bombings. There is no cure for terrorism. The genie is out of the bottle, and it's not going to be put back in. Finally, even if Islamic militancy functioned like an infectious disease, other forms of terrorist violence don't seem to fit this model. It seems difficult to apply the counter-epidemic model to groups that perform terrorism in the name of anarchism or Marxism, or other terrorist groups that engage in political violence to defend the environment, protect animals, or fight for ethnic nationalism as their primary causes. Even if you bought the notion that Islamic militancy spreads like an infectious disease, the same rules of social contagion don't really seem to apply to the spread of these other forms of terrorism. Today, I offer an alternative model for counterterrorism, a small but important modification on the epidemiological approach. The medical nerds in the audience, if there are any, and apparently there's probably one on the panel, know that epidemiology has two strands. It's the study of infectious diseases and the study of chronic diseases. Now, Stairs and Yakubian chose the infectious disease model, but I think terrorism is better understood and explained as a chronic disease like cancer. Not only does terrorism behave more like a chronic disease, but many of the dynamics associated with preventing and treating cancer are remarkably similar to those associated with combating terrorism. The similarities are striking, from the endogenous and exogenous causes of both phenomena to the evolution of tactics and strategies aimed at defeating both maladies. Cancer is a disease caused by mutations of a single normal cell, just like terrorists are mutated, distorted versions of everyday people. Psychologists who study terrorism have thus far been unable to determine systematic pathologies and neuroabnormalities in terrorists. Sometimes these mutations are triggered by internal mechanisms. In other words, sometimes it just happens due to nature, but in other cases, these mutations occur because of external events, like the introduction of a carcinogen like asbestos or tobacco, or overexposure to UV rays and radiation. The same dynamics are found in terrorists, where some become self-radicalized while others are triggered by external events and persuasive recruitment. In terrorism, we don't call it mutation, though. We call it radicalization. And just like cancer, it can happen to all types of people: wealthy people, poor people, young, old, the educated, and the unemployed. And despite the fact that we have been studying cancer for literally thousands of years, cancer epidemiologists know only the basics about the causes of cancer. Billions of dollars have been spent on cancer research in recent decades, but according to a recent report in the New York Times, the death rate for cancer, adjusted for the size and age of the population, dropped only 5% from 1950 to 2005. To provide some comparison to this tiny 5% drop to that of a prominent infectious disease, the death rate for the flu dropped 58% over the same time period. Ask yourselves, are we really any better in the field of terrorism studies? Are we really any closer than our oncologist counterparts in identifying the exact causes of terrorism? I would argue no. While this is probably beautiful music to the ears of all of the budding terrorism scholars in the audience, not to mention excellent job security for those of us who are already studying terrorism, I think in counterterrorism we can all easily identify with cancer investigators when they say the more they study cancer, the more complex it seems. So if epidemiologists have been unable to determine the exact cause of cancer, how have they approached combating this insidious disease? More importantly, what can counterterrorism scholars and practitioners learn from them? I would argue a lot. To combat cancer, doctors focus on prevention, treatment, and palliative care. I believe we should use the same approach with counterterrorism. First, let's talk about prevention. Now, doctors cannot prevent anyone from getting cancer, just like the states cannot prevent 100% of terrorist attacks. However, doctors tell us we can reduce our chances of getting cancer by avoiding risky behaviors like smoking tobacco, excessive drinking, and overexposure to the sun. Similarly, states can reduce their chances of getting attacked by terrorists by enacting similar macro-level policies, like providing minority groups meaningful access to the political system and taking active measures to bring disenfranchised groups back into the mainstream fold. Like eating your broccoli and getting your 60 minutes of cardio every day, enacting these kinds of policies can be extremely hard to do, especially when the benefits derived from such activities are rarely directly observed. While doctors cannot prevent people from getting cancer, nor accurately predict who will get it before it strikes, the early identification and treatment of certain types of cancer, like colon cancer, for example, have dramatically increased patient survival. Now, I believe the same rules apply to counterterrorism, where we are at a similar disadvantage in terms of preventing and predicting. For example, in my own research on leadership decapitation, I found that terrorist groups that lose their leader to kill or capture in the first year of existence are more than 8.5 times more likely to end than non-decapitated groups. Wait to remove the leader 10 years down the road, however, and the effects are cut in half. Wait 20 years, and killing or capturing the leader may have no effect on the group's mortality whatsoever. Second, we can learn from the evolution in treating cancer over time. Here again, the similarities are striking. In 1945, the U.S. announced the war on cancer, even calling it a crusade, and stood up a national-level organization from scratch, the National Cancer Institute, that was supposed to be stripped of its bureaucratic excesses and to be the antidote to the ad hoc, diffuse, and stovepipe campaign that was blocking previous efforts at finding a cure. Fast forward six decades later, the U.S. announced its war on terrorism, even called it a crusade at one point, and stood up a national-level organization from scratch, the National Counter-Terrorism Center, that was supposed to be stripped of its bureaucratic excesses and serve as the antidote to the ad hoc, diffuse, and stovepipe campaign that blocked previous efforts at fighting terrorism. I'll leave it to you to judge whether each achieved their original goals. Now, earlier I described the macro-level policies that states may enact to reduce the likelihood of terrorism. At the tactical level, though, the secret to battling cancer is to prevent mutations from occurring in normal cells, or to find ways to eliminate the mutated cells without hurting the normal ones. I would argue that counterterrorism operates in a similar manner. Either prevent radicalization from occurring, or find ways to eliminate terrorists without collateral damage or creating new terrorists. This was supposed to be the argument for the use of drones, but much work needs to be done to confirm the effectiveness of this tactic. Now, in the early days of treating cancer, the only tool in the toolbox for oncologists was the knife. Without a proper understanding of the disease, they operated on a more is better mentality when it came to removing tumors. This more is better approach carried over when chemotherapy and radiation were added to the toolbox. As a result, numerous cancer patients thus unnecessarily died during these early years when surgeons and oncologists went too far, cutting out too much or prescribing doses that were way too high. Even if the patients survived these brutal treatments, the surgery left them so disfigured and sick that they wished they were dead. Someone once said, "Cancer therapy is like beating a dog with a stick to get rid of his fleas." Now, the early days of counterterrorism mirror this evolution in cancer treatment. Instead of using a knife to do more harm than good, like those early surgeons, the French used their only tool in its counterterrorism toolbox at the time, the hammer, in its attempt to defeat the FLN in Algeria in the 1950s. As so brilliantly shown in the Battle of Algiers, the French won the battle, but they ultimately lost the war due to their over-the-top heavy-handedness. Today, oncologists use multiple tools in the toolbox. They use surgery, radiation therapy, and chemotherapy, and palliative care to attack cancer. Not only is it common for them to use several of these treatments at once, but they attack each type of cancer differently. If caught early enough, for example, colon cancer can be completely removed by simple surgery. For testicular cancer, chemotherapy is the most effective. Lung cancer is treated with all three: surgery, chemo, radiation. Now, those crafting counterterrorism policies should take heed. Since there is no magic bullet or one-size-fits-all approach in counterterrorism, states should use a similar nuanced approach that oncologists use. For example, there's a lot of talk about a, quote, whole-of-government approach to American counterterrorism. but are we really effectively using all the tools in our toolbox? I think work on counterterrorism effectiveness is still in its infant stage, and it's one of the areas at the Combating Terrorism Center that we are focusing on. Finally, treating cancer involves palliative care at every stage of the process, from diagnosis to death, and it's something that we should model in counterterrorism. Palliative care includes pain management, building emotional resilience, refining coping skills, and establishing proper expectations. Since it is impossible to prevent terrorism, we need to stop saying that our goal is to defeat it. Additionally, we need to help the public craft appropriate expectations about the threat posed by terrorism and what the state can do to handle attacks when they arise. Take this year's Boston bombing, for example. Although those involved with bringing the Boston bombers to justice did an unbelievable job, shutting down a major U.S. city for 3 days after 2 relatively rudimentary homemade bombs detonated is not and cannot be a sustainable model moving forward. Now, I know that both the U.S. and Israel take resiliency extremely seriously, but I think more can be done to properly emotionally prepare our populations for what will undoubtedly be more terrorist attacks in the future. Doing nothing to shape proper expectations is negligent. Giving our populations the expectation that we can defeat terrorism is worse. After all, if we've learned anything from the thousands of years we've grappled with cancer, we cannot cure an incurable disease. What we can do, however, is combat it more effectively. Thanks for allowing me to speak to you all today, and thank you for being so attentive.